Good evening. Are you nice and warm yet? Very good. As you know, McGill has a very slow system of adaptation, and so yesterday it was cold, and today we're heating. So I give you the opportunity now to take off any jacket that you might want to take off and get adapted. I can promise that where we will be afterwards is slightly cooler, so there's hope. But maybe this is actually a very good climate for us to realize in the context of tonight for several reasons, right? GMOs are a hot topic. That is one reason, pun intended. Also, climate change is a hot topic. What do the two have in common, or where is that common denominator? There is actually one, and maybe during the discussion today we will come to an insight on how the two are linked. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Agriculture and Environmental Sciences. My name is Anja Geitmann, and I welcome you to this evening. This is one of our signature events. The De Grand Prix lecture series is named after Jean de Grand Prix, who's sitting in the first row, and we are delighted to have him here. It's a series that has been going on for several years, and each year we try to choose a topic that is of general interest, that touches a lot of people, that has to do with society as well as what this faculty does. And this faculty has in its name the term agriculture and environmental sciences for a reason. And each year we find topics that are really, really interesting, and to which we invite speakers who have something to say. And last year, for example, we talked about conservation, again, something that links back to what is currently going on, and that is climate change. Each year, we also try to look at the topic and at the theme. I take it closer. Each year, we also try to look at the topic and at the theme from different angles, right? Every issue has multiple angles, and so we try to look at a topic from various angles. And that is what this faculty and the experts and the professors at this faculty do, interdisciplinary research, right? Not only do we have different departments and different types of expertise ranging from natural science to agriculture to plant science, animal science and nutrition, but also do we have different angles with which we look at issues ranging from a molecular biologist to an engineer to a biochemist, etc. And many of you are probably alumni of this faculty and know this very well. I see nodding in the room. So that is a particular delight to actually see the alumni back in this room as well. Tonight, as I mentioned, we have a topic that is of very current interest for multiple reasons again. GMOs, genetically modified organisms, are organisms whose genome has been modified for one reason or the other. We will see that despite the very short and succinct abbreviation, that is actually something that is not that easily explained or understandable, even if at the time you were a plant scientist here at the faculty, especially with recent developments such as CRISPR that you might have heard about, or developments such as the regulatory network in Europe, who have taken decisions that may or may not be applauded by people around the world, but also in particular by scientists around the world. And so tonight I welcome two speakers who I'm convinced you will find very, very interesting. The first one is Rob Saik. He is the founder of the AgriTrend group of companies, and he is a professional agrologist and certified agricultural consultant. He has developed agri-data solution softwares, which is essentially an online farm data management tool. He is the author of a book that I'm sure he's going to mention, and it is called The Agricultural Manifesto, no less. And that talks about 10 key drivers that will shape agriculture in the next decade. He will start off our discussion. Before then, our second speaker kicks in. Our second speaker is Sara Berger Richardson, and I'm going to introduce her properly just before her presentation. So, the format of tonight will be a panel discussion, but each of the two presenters will get 10 minutes to give us a summary of their points. There will be no question period right after the first speaker. We will go directly to the second speaker, and after that, we will open the discussion. And I'm looking forward for very lively comments from the audience. With that, I'm going to give the word to Robert Syke, who is the first speaker, and I give you both the microphone as well as the clicker, and go ahead.
Thank you. Can I use this mic here? Okay, great. I am not a toxicologist. I am not a physician. I'm not a genomist, a genomic breeder. I am an agrologist. I work with farmers every day and have done my entire career. I picked up the mantle on GMO about 8 years ago, and I think this is quite accurate. Generally misunderstood organism. So a quick survey of the room. How many people think GMOs are bad? Okay. How many think GMOs are good? All right. How many are unsure about GMOs? Fair enough. In 2013, The Economist magazine, fairly reputable magazine, said when it comes to GMO, we have misplaced priorities. In 2013, the number of children in the world who died under the age of 5 from malnutrition was 3.1 million children died from malnutrition under the age of 5 in that year. The number of children who have died from GMO ever is 0. Now, I'm not saying that GMO will solve all the problems, save all of those lives, but it could go a long way to helping us achieve those lives. And I'll make my arguments. This picture I took in Lodwar, Kenya. I have a farm in Uganda that I'm involved in right now, so I've worked in Kenya, Nigeria, Uganda, Tanzania. And this picture was taken in one of the poorest spots I've ever visited. This lady is clutching the two most precious things, her child and her technology. There are very few people in the audience, I think, that would be so callous as to walk up and rip that phone out of her hand, because a text message will tell her where there's food and where there's water. So when I get asked if agriculture can feed 10 billion people, I'm saying that's not the question. The question is, will agriculture be allowed to feed 10 billion people? Because there are all sorts of people out there, well-intentioned people, far removed from agriculture, that are intent on ripping technology out of farmers' hands. This technology is important for us to maintain global food security. Today we live in a world of environmentalism and a lot of food religion. And I don't care which food religion you belong to, whether you're paleo or vegan or mediterranean, doesn't really matter to me. I think we all agree that agriculture must be infinitely sustainable. And sustainability is at the heart of the discussion. So no matter what side of the argument or table that you're on, at the end of the day, this 6-inch slice of soil that sustains all plants and animals on the planet is vital. And that long-term agricultural sustainability is at the heart of what we should be discussing. And yet, in the first world, food paranoia is running rampant. If you punch in GMO into Google Images, this is what you see. I don't know what's wrong with these fruits and vegetables. Maybe they're diabetic. I don't know. But if you know someone who is diabetic, they're being kept alive with a GMO. Humalog and Novolin are genetically engineered insulins. But there's people everywhere protesting against GMO. Maybe they're protesting against hemophiliacs, because hemophiliacs are also being kept alive with GMO technology. Or maybe Ebola virus vaccines is something that these people are upset against. Or maybe they're protesting against hard cheese, because 90% of the hard cheese that we eat in North America is GMO'd, because the coagulant chismosome is used to coagulate the cheese instead of scraping out the fourth lining of the calf's stomach. So there's a lot of GMO around. People are freaked out over GMO. Almost nobody can tell you what a GMO is. Almost nobody can define it. And yet, most people are afraid of it. What is it? Can you, in the audience, can you define it, what a GMO is? So I got some questions for you. I just want you to do a mental exercise. I'm going to put some things up on the screen. I want you to say yes or no, it is a GMO or not. Is this a GMO? A bacteria moves genes from one species into another. GMO or not? What do you think? All right, what? I don't have time for the right now. A gene from a species moves into a cousin of the same species. Plants are bred to be herbicide resistant. Genes within a plant are switched off. No new genes are added. Plant chromosomes are randomly mutated through exposure to nuclear radiation. A segment of defective DNA is repaired within an organism. Plants are exposed to carcinogenic chemicals to induce mutation. If you cannot define a GMO, how can you label it? This is one of the issues we're facing. When the American professor Jason Lusk interviewed Americans, 82% of Americans saying food containing GMO should be labeled. In the same survey, they said 80% of Americans say food containing DNA should be labeled. Well, it's funny, but people just don't know, right? Virtually all food has been modified. Carrots weren't orange, they were white and purple initially. Genetic engineering is nothing more than a progression of this breeding evolutionary path we've been on. This is the realm of genetic engineering. You start with open pollination, hybridization, polyploid, mutagenesis, which is interesting, cross species, but then you get into RNAi, transgenic, cisgenic, gene editing, gene silencing, and then more lately CRISPR-Cas9 and CRISPR-Cas12. It's a continuum of breeding processes. So genetic engineering is not an ingredient. It's not an ingredient. It's not an ingredient. It's a breeding process. And if we're going to label one, we should label them all. But right now we have a proliferation of something called absence labeling. GMOs have no allergies, no food recalls, no food poisoning. So why is there proliferation of labels against something that has an impeccable track record? The reason is to create fear, uncertainty, and doubt, or FUD, to create FUD, so people are scared of food. This one, wild turkey liquor. It's non-GMO alcohol. I guess when you're going to get hammered, you want to get non-GMO hammered. I'm not sure. Non-GMO butterfly label. If there's no GMO alternative like this non-GMO walnut oil, there's no genetically engineered walnuts. This is a deceptive label like Hunt's is doing with their tomatoes. No GMO in sight. There are no GMO tomatoes available in the marketplace. Shreddies, non-GMO shreddies, and underneath they said like all wheat, wheat and shredded is not genetically engineered, but still slap the label on to create FUD. It's like this. It's like putting 100% boneless watermelon for sale. It's a meaningless term. So based on a breeding method that has no negative impacts, that has an impeccable track record, that has nothing, is nothing more than absence labeling, is it necessary for us to continue to perpetuate FUD in the food supply? I believe it's time to change the conversation from no GMO to one of no GMO to understand it. This is work that we've done at nogmo.ca and No Ideas Media. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Saik. As promised, we will proceed directly to our second speaker. And our second speaker is Sara Berger Richardson. She is a doctoral candidate at the Faculty of Law, has already obtained degrees from McGill, and her research focuses on the relationship between science and ethics, in particular in food law and policy. She has also been a teaching fellow at Dalhousie Schulich School of Law, and she's been a consultant with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute for the government of the Northwest Territories. She's a member of the Law Society of Upper Canada and Food Lawyers of Canada, and she will talk about one aspect that we already heard in this presentation, and that is the question of labeling. But now, as promised, from a completely different angle. Sara, please.
Okay, so I'm not here today to take a position or a side in relation to GMOs or genetically engineered food. What I wanted to do was not so much present a debate to what was said before, but more to think about why we're talking about labeling in the first place, what it means to regulate food, and that's the background that I bring. So I came to do my PhD in law at McGill because I was interested in how we produce food and how we regulate the food that we want to see in the market. My work is especially in relation to the way we regulate meat, but the way in which science and ethics are negotiated in food law and policy is also one that is very relevant to GMOs. So the first thing, if we're talking about labeling, is to understand what we mean by the laws around regulation of GE foods. So the first thing I'll mention briefly is what does it mean to regulate GE foods. What that means in the context of Canada, there's some interesting developments happening in the United States and also in Europe that might inform the conversation we have later on, that might change some of your ideas or might kind of help frame some of the questions you might have. And then to think about just generally what are some of the other reasons why we might want to label that are not about safety and why we use labeling in general. So first, in Canada, the way in which we regulate food is a little bit complicated because we're a federal system. So the federal government has jurisdiction in some areas, the provincial government has jurisdiction in others. Generally, labeling in Canada happens at the federal level. So Health Canada and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency are the two agencies that are really responsible for food labeling. But the provincial government is also there in terms of consumer protection. So both levels of government do have regulations around labels that are false or misleading and kind of fraudulent labeling. So that's one area where there is some oversight. And then Health Canada is really responsible for determining whether food makes its way onto the market, that food is safe. So we don't have any regulations in Canada for mandatory labeling. The federal government has developed voluntary guidelines, so producers can put certain labels on, and I think some of those labels might potentially cause some confusion, or there might be some contention around their use, but there are certain voluntary guidelines around whether you would want to include information about GMOs on the products or not. And again, those would have to not be false or misleading, and there might be some question about whether some of them are. But we don't have any mandatory labeling in Canada. So there has been some discussion, but nothing requiring any producer to put that kind of label on it. Internationally, there are some differences. So the first thing that I want to bring to your attention is the Codex Alimentarius, because that actually does have some kind of influence on the Canadian regulatory context. So because of all the rules of international trade, Canada is expected to follow certain international standards in terms of its own regulations around food. So the Codex Alimentarius provides certain standards for food, not only around GE foods, but food in general and food safety. And while it's been very slow in terms of making progress around coming up with a general agreed upon kind of series of guidelines for GE foods, there are certain principles that have emerged. They came out in 2011, but it's slow progress. There's a lot of disagreement internationally. Maybe things will change now that the US is changing things with their labeling requirements. But the reason why this is important, just for those who are interested in labeling in Canada, is that the voluntary principles at the Codex mean that if a country chose to have labels around GE foods, that wouldn't be considered a barrier to trade. Other kinds of regulations that we would impose on food could be considered barriers to trade and could result in conflicts. And so for those of you who know about the beef hormones dispute that went on for decades between Europe and North America, those kinds of regulations around food do constitute barriers to trade, but because there's this general kind of consensus around these principles at the Codex, there is more freedom for countries to adopt different kinds of rules around GE foods. So that's just interesting because it means that there is a possibility for Canada to do this without having to kind of go to court to defend that decision. Europe was mentioned at the beginning of this talk. For those of you who follow GE news, there was an important decision that came out of the European Court of Justice that basically said that technologies like CRISPR would now fall under the same kind of strict directives for genetically modified organisms. And that was seen as quite a blow to the scientific community that was hoping to have CRISPR technology seen as treated differently. But that kind of makes sense within the European context of having stronger rules around GE foods. What's interesting is that the court really took a pretty bold stand on GE foods because they had received a judicial opinion suggesting that they should not include GE foods, and they went against that opinion, which is not very common. And so I think there's probably some political questions as to why they chose to go in that direction. And again, what's interesting about this decision is that they also carved out a certain space for exemptions. And so this, I'll get to a little bit later on, but the way in which laws and labeling and courts, they're constantly navigating a lot of different political, moral, economic concerns. It's not just a question of is it safe, is it not? They're trying to navigate a lot of different things. And so by siding with the people who brought the claim to court, but then carving out exemptions, they might have been trying to balance something maybe in a way that wasn't acceptable to everyone, but it's their way of working on it. And then very close to us, the United States is interesting because at a national level, they're now moving towards having mandatory labeling for GE foods. And that is, I think, quite surprising to many who followed this because no one expected the United States, of all countries, to be the ones taking mandatory labeling because historically they've been the ones who've been pushing GMOs and other countries were resistant. So this will really change, I think, the kind of regulatory landscape for other countries if the US does this. And a lot of the move from this came from Vermont. Vermont was the first state that passed. It was a big breakthrough when they did this in 2016 to have mandatory labeling, but that law got preempted because the USDA federally decided, well, we're going to do it for the whole country. And that makes sense because once corporations are changing labels for one particular state, they'd be doing it for everyone. And so there's also, again, you see the economics behind why you would have kind of countries requiring this kind of labeling. So internationally, there's a codex, there's Europe, which suggests, potentially there's space for moving towards more regulations, the US as well, for different reasons. And that basically kind of begs the question, well, why would we regulate? If the EU is regulating, if the US is regulating, generally the conversation around GE foods turns to perceptions of risk, right? So, and a lot of what we heard before is, perceptions, and there's fear, and there's doubt, and there's anxiety about whether GE foods are safe. And that's the reason why we regulate most of the food that we have. So we have regulations for all kinds of foods because we want to make sure that it's safe. Health Canada, in the Canadian context, has determined that by determining if food is safe before it reaches the market, we don't need to label it because they have determined for us that it is safe. But the questions around whether food is safe or not are, even if they're scientific, they're also highly localized and contextualized. So to take a non-genetically modified example, if we look even in Canada, in Quebec, we allow the production of raw, unpasteurized cheese. Other provinces do not. The entire country, every province agrees that unpasteurized milk in liquid form poses an unacceptable risk, but in Quebec, we do allow unpasteurized cheese, and everyone has agreed that we allow this because it tastes good. We don't have different science in Quebec. We don't think that somehow there isn't a risk of unpasteurized cheese in Quebec where there is a risk. There is a risk in Quebec, but there was a decision made at the regulatory level that that risk was acceptable. It's acceptable because of the benefits that we've decided as a group that we are okay with. And other jurisdictions are not okay with that. And that's how we regulate food. It's not just getting the lab results and then saying we're going to regulate or not. It's saying, well, how do we manage this? So I'll just go back to this. And technically speaking, kind of the way that this is happening in food safety regulation is we talk about the risk analysis paradigm. So the risk assessment is usually what happens in buildings like this. The research happens, but what you do with that research, the way in which you manage that research, the way in which you manage that with economic concerns, with political concerns. If we think about even in the elections here in Quebec, supply management, it's not only about dairy, it's about politics, it's about economics, it's about social, rural. All of these things come into the way in which we regulate food. So there's risk management, there's risk assessment, and there's also risk communication. How do we then communicate to consumers? How do we communicate to the public how we've come down on this risk? And so we'll label raw milk cheese as being unpasteurized, and then people can make a decision. So the risk assessment, the risk analysis paradigm is the way in which it's the jargon for food safety regulations. So I mentioned that there's geographical differences, Quebec versus Ontario, the way in which we regulate food. But there's also other reasons why people might want to regulate genetically modified organisms. And so safety is one, and I think that's one where many people in this room will have a very informed opinion about whether those concerns are justified. You have your scientific backgrounds that help you kind of come down on one side or the other on that question. But there are other reasons why people might want to label foods. And the idea of people wanting to label food, as we heard before, that has DNA in it, just goes to show how poor our food literacy is in North America, how little most people know about their food. And so if there's distrust, I think we can roll our eyes on a certain, on one hand and say that this is crazy, but on the other hand, it just suggests that people really don't know where their food is. And labeling is one way that consumers feel that they can hold corporations accountable, that they can hold producers accountable, that they can have some kind of transparency in terms of knowing where their food comes from. It may not be rational, but there is a certain sense that you don't know where your food is coming from, and buying your food at Loblaws is not the same thing as buying your food from a CSA basket. And the relationship you have with the producer, the trust you have is different. So labeling does a lot in terms of trust, and it also gets to other concerns about environment, it gets to corporate control of industry, it gets to many other things, seed sovereignty, indigenous food sovereignty. Those are all reasons why we might want to label. The question, and I'll leave this here because I think you'll probably have questions that will touch on this, is just whether labeling is the best way to achieve those goals. So labeling tells us something, but if labeling GEs is not labeling an ingredient, if it's a method of production, it's a method of ownership, does labeling achieve what we want? I mean, we label things like free-range eggs, we label things like humane meat. We also question how effective and efficient those kinds of labeling techniques are. So maybe labeling is a way of achieving what people want from their food system, but maybe labeling isn't the right tool to achieve a certain objective. So I'm putting that out there just to kind of think about how we frame the discussion also that goes forward. Labeling can achieve certain things. There's certain rules around how we label, but the questions around genetically modified foods are also much broader than potentially what labeling can do. That's the wrap-up. That's what we covered.
All right, thank you very much. So you've seen that these were two almost orthogonal views on the same issue, right? And so I'm inviting now both Sara and Robert to come up here and join me here on the podium. And with that, I'm going to open for questions. So, please. And we have to use a microphone since I should have mentioned that from the beginning. This event is being live streamed. So if anybody says anything outside of the microphone, it won't go into the live stream. So we will hand around microphones. Did one microphone reach the gentleman? And so please wait until you actually have the microphone in hand until you ask your question. Thank you.
I have read about genetically modified salmon that have been designed, you might say, to grow very, very rapidly for production purposes. It's obviously economically beneficial, but a lot of people are saying, no, but there's danger. We don't know what the long-term effects are. And others say, but it's exactly the same as any other salmon. The fact that it has grown faster, I mean, once you get it, you couldn't tell one from the other. Could you comment about that, please?
I'll start. So this is an interesting topic. We're constantly encouraged to eat wild salmon. But if you've been salmon fishing, there's constantly pressure on stopping the wild salmon harvest. So we should stop we should eat wild salmon and we should stop fishing for wild salmon. Somehow we got to, and then we should farm salmon, but not in the oceans. So this topic where you take a gene and effectively grow the salmon inland so it doesn't come in contact with the ocean, and it provides people with salmon, and it's the meat is identical to salmon, and it grows twice as fast as regular salmon. To me, seems like a very logical way to provide people with greater access to salmon and fish and omegas that everybody's encouraging us to eat. So that's my point on it.
So I think my point on this would be, I would want to go a step backwards and ask, why do you want the fish to grow twice as quickly? And there could be many reasons why, but maybe people, there's a lot of reasons why we would want to grow food more quickly. It's cheaper, there's more access to it, and if that's what people want, great. If some people say, well, I would like, for traditional reasons, to grow and raise fish in a different way, and I'm willing to spend more. It's not a question of safety, but this is my choice. I don't think we should be, I want to go into a slow food movement. Those are social, those are moral reasons to be thinking about food, and I don't think there's one that's right or wrong, but I think it's part of a conversation. So if the conversation is, well, I'm scared of this fish because I think it's dangerous to me, you can probably respond with one set of facts. But if the concern is, well, I don't want one person raising thousands and thousands of fish at no cost and pushing other producers or other fishers out of the market, that's another question, right? And so I think it's getting to why we're doing this.
All right, thank you. There's a question over there.
Would you object to labeling foods as genetically modified and let the consumer decide in the marketplace whether they wanted to buy it or not?
Well, this is an interesting point, and I think we're very much at that point right now. As Sara has mentioned, U.S. is grappling with this issue. Canada, again, regulates based on novel traits, so it doesn't matter whether the produce was generated through chemonuclear radiation or crossbreeding or conventional. The question would be is, I know the USDA is struggling with this right now, is what is a GMO? What is genetically engineered? I gave you a continuum there, and I think that, as soon as you label it, that science is going to bring along ancillary breeding methods that are going to be right parallel or right beside it. And so will you extend that? And who makes those decisions? I think personally that Canada has a very, very rational approach to labeling and food registration because it's based on novel trait. I think we are coming to that discussion in the United States because of what they're doing over there. But I know for a fact that they are massively grappling with trying to figure out how this definition works out.
So I have a couple of comments. The first is, in Canada, at least from a regulatory perspective, we tend to differentiate between GMO and genetically engineered foods. So at least Health Canada tries to say that basically anything and everything would fall under the GMO category. So labeling that is pretty useless. But potentially labeling genetically engineered food, and that's where the voluntary guidelines exist. In terms of the right to know, a lot of people push for labels because of an argument that there's a right to know what's in their food. In the US, there was a study that just came out this summer in Vermont, with all the labeling that was coming out, and people wanted to know whether the mandatory labeling would change people's opinions and would really kind of fuel fear around GMOs, and the result was the opposite. So the labeling actually improved people's perception of trust in GMO foods, and the reason that was given in the study was that there was better trust and transparency. So again, there's probably a lack of information, and maybe your right to know is helpful. The flip side is I really don't think that labels are the best way for people who are trying to change a food system to really achieve what they want. Labelings are always going to be a simplification. They can't convey all the information that either side wants, so producers can't convey everything that they want. Consumers aren't going to get all the information. So it's a step, but it might not be the step that either party wants, but it's probably the easiest. It's much easier than other kinds of change, but in my view, it's an imperfect solution.
Here's an example that you'll have to grapple with. When a lot of you folks in the room are my age, I was born in 1960, and when we had grapefruits in 1960, they were white fleshed. Do you remember that? Now all the grapefruit is red fleshed. Well, how did that happen? Well, that happened because what they did was they took grapefruit seeds and they exposed the grapefruit seeds to gamma nuclear radiation. And they did them at different times. So they exposed them for a week or a day or a month or whatever, and then they'd grow them out, and boom, all of a sudden chromosomes are scrambled, and out came Rio Red grapefruit. Rio Red grapefruit was generated through nuclear mutation. It's called mutagenesis. Paradoxically, this is also labeled under conventional breeding methods, and paradoxically yet, you could put a chemonuclear mutated non-GMO organic label on this. So you see how complicated it gets real fast? Just making a point. It is. And this is what Sara is saying. This is complex stuff.
Hi, I just want to know if organic food is labeled as GMO or genetically engineered. Is organic
So it's two
considered?
separate things. So organic certification is separate from GM. So you can have organic food that is GM. GM labeling is voluntary. If you want to have the label for organic certification, so when you see certified organic, that is a whole certification process that is separate from whatever voluntary labeling you would choose to do.
When it comes to organic, and so I work with commercial farmers in all stripes and versions, and there's not a farmer I've met yet that wants to use more fertilizer and wants to spray on more pesticide. I've never met one. And so what my vision of the future would be is to decrease the dependency on pesticides and fertilizers, because that's putting a load on our environment, and I get it. We all get it. So the only way to do that is to utilize science. The only science that I know of that would allow us to extract nutrients out of soil better or decrease the dependency on pesticides is genetic engineering. So paradoxically, I think that the future should be GMO, genetically modified organic farming. And when you think that through, that makes a lot of sense. But the organic movement, by and large, has also become the anti-GMO movement, when there should be a coming together, not a separation.
Anti-GMOs.
Would you like to repeat that for our listeners?
Why is Europe so much anti-GMOs?
Thank you for sponsoring this event, by the way. That's a great question. I'll start off, and Sara can. I think there's a number of reasons. I think we shouldn't lose sight of the corporate interests. If you go back to when genetic engineering started, Monsanto, a U.S. company, made a leapfrog in bioengineering. They leapfrogged Bayer. They leapfrogged BASF. They leapfrogged Syngenta. And all of a sudden, those companies that sold a lot of chemistry, all of a sudden we're looking at a marketplace where farmers were planting Roundup or Roundup-ready crops and using Roundup. And all of so that's the first thing. I think that we shouldn't underestimate the fact that the movement into genetically engineered crops, first of all, came from America. Had Monsanto been based in Basel, Switzerland, I don't think the issue would be nearly as profound as it is today. Secondly, I think that you have a real powerful green movement in Europe, and it's there's a lot of money being raised through fear. I mean, Greenpeace alone raises over $10 million in Europe a year. U.S. dollars a year, and they're sitting on over half a billion dollars in cash right now. You don't think that machine can spit out a lot of anti-propaganda if they want to? And the third one, I think, is it's trade barriers, non-tariff trade barriers. I think that's one that enters into it, and I haven't gone deeper than that. But those would be my 3 points off the top of my head.
So one very practical reason from a political, legal perspective as to why the rules are different in Canada and Europe is the way in which the regulatory decisions are made in Canada are different. So in Europe, just the parliamentary structure, the way that these laws are being developed, they're being developed more by the politicians who are accountable to their electorates, and so they're responding more to their electorate's concerns, whereas in Canada, it's an executive decision. So Health Canada is making decisions irrespective of what the Liberals or the Conservatives or the NDP are saying. So the regulatory and kind of political structure is different, which means that different kinds of pressures exist in Europe that don't exist in Canada. So that's one reason. Culture and economics are also very important here. And so the way in which traditional landscapes, not only food, but landscape in terms of agriculture and what's called foodscapes, the way in which traditional rural kinds of production are valued in Europe are different from in Canada. So Canada has a long history of wanting to produce more, and Europe has a long history of wanting to maintain very unique, localized methods of production and even just the visual nature of what the countryside looks like. Now, there's not necessarily a correlation between the two, but that definitely changes the discourse, the way in which these conversations happen. And so that's one. And that's also where, I mean, just generally the way rules are made in Europe is they are stronger proponents of the precautionary principle in terms of all of their decision making. And so again, you can have two scientific, your risk analysis, they can both be scientific, but if you're using the precautionary principle, you're going to maybe come down differently than if you're not.
The precautionary principle actually hails out of the 2003 Cartagena Protocol, which a bunch of countries signed. Canada, the United States did not sign. The precautionary principle in science means that you can't bring something out until you can prove it's safe. Well, that's a double negative in science. You can never prove that something is safe because the next study could prove that it's not. So the precautionary principle underlying the European guidelines for it eliminates risk-benefit. So I just wrote an article that basically stated that in my mind, Europe is moving quickly into the Museum of Agriculture on the planet. And I just, in The Economist, last issue of Economist magazine, UK is dealing with Brexit right now, and it's estimated that without subsidies going to the UK farmers, 56% of them will be in red ink. So the European population is very comfortable in massively subsidizing farmers to do rural landscapes so that it's pretty when they drive. Canada's different.
Oh, there's Peter.
Packaging is becoming so cluttered with labeling right now. I really wonder who reads these labels. I presume somebody has done a study to determine that, but I'd like to know the answer. I know recently I went into a McDonald's and I was looking at their menu up on the wall, deciding what I wanted to eat, and that's partly based on the price of the commodity, but I couldn't find the price. It was too cluttered up with calories, which I really wasn't interested in.
I'll let you take it first.
Sure. So there's been a lot of movement over the past several years around labeling, and the federal government, I think, has been pushing very hard for what they think is a simplified series of labeling for products. And so ingredients, I mean, the new health guide, everything's coming out and supposed to be simplified, but there's still, I agree, a lot of information. But that's because most people don't know what's in their food anymore. And increasingly, right, and younger generations are also not really willing to put in the time to cook food themselves. And so labels tell us all the information that maybe your parents told you, that you knew from putting the ingredients together. If you're buying packaged things, you don't know what's in them, so you need to get the information yourself. If you're not putting a pinch of salt in, people don't know. So there's a real problem, and this is not, I mean, you're not the first person to point out that people are asking for more and more labels, and half of them are ignoring them, and half of them aren't getting the information they actually want from them. So they're not really working. But we also are in a situation where most people don't really know what their food is.
A couple of years ago, I cornered the vice president of marketing of A&W, and I asked her, what's the difference between a hormone and a steroid? Because a steroid is a hormone, and a hormone is a steroid. And there wasn't a really good answer, other than double the words means double the fear. The difference in beef, because I'm a beef producer, the difference between beef that has a hormone implant and non-hormone implant is like 1.9 nanograms per beef patty, I'll guarantee you there's far more hormone in the French fries and the bread that's making that bun up than there would ever be from the hormones affected in the beef. And one of the things I'd like cheekily to ask them is how much hormones is in the Beyond Meat burger that's now being served, because that would be an interesting one to know. You know, so on the labeling side, I'm not a real big Whole Foods fan, but they've got one rating in their store that's interesting. It's called the Andy rating. It's called the Average Nutrient Density Index. Average Nutrient Density Index. I think that's a good rating. I think we should be telling people not so much what's not in their food and telling them more about the nutritional qualities of their food. I think that would be a way to go.
I think you seem to have a follow-up to that. When I was answering you, I saw you reach for the mic.
It's just that I have faith in, to some extent, Canadian government. We have Foods Canada, and I guess as a consumer, I think that the products that are on my grocery store shelf have been examined by the organization that should be okaying it or getting it off the shelf. That shouldn't be my job, I don't think. I'm prepared to go into the store. I like the looks of that product. I'll buy it. I'll consume it. And I hope that Foods Canada has done their job.
But what do you think their job is? Because they can be, so Health Canada is doing a lot to make sure the food is safe. Just safe means different things to different people, right? And again, if you go back, if you're in Europe, you don't want hormones in your beef. If you're in Canada, you don't care. But if you're in Canada, you know, we'll have different perceptions. You know, everything is different depending on who you are. So we want food that's safe, but how do they determine? And you know, you could live on a diet of canned beans and canned everything exclusively for 12 months a year. It's safe. But would you think that that's a good diet?
No, again, I believe Foods Canada comes up with recommended diets, and it's supposed to be balanced. But again, in the first place, I don't want to live on pork and beans. I think anybody would get sick of it. But once again, if a food product is safe, I don't care if it's GMO or non-GMO. I don't care if it's organic or non-organic. It's safe to eat. If I choose to pay twice the price for an organic food, that, as you indicated, is my decision. I don't particularly care to make that choice, so I will take the non-organic product at a lower price that I believe is safe and worthy to eat.
Sure, but you need the label to know that you're paying less or more, right? You need the label to tell you, well, I'm going to pay half price for this. I don't care if it's organic. And the other person needs the label to say, I'm willing to pay twice the price.
I don't need the label. I can look at the price underneath the commodity and know if it's twice the price.
You know, one thing that I think we should be very proud of as Canadians is, at least to the greatest extent possible, you make a really important point, that the food regulation process in Canada is apolitical. It's not politicized. And I think that, again, my opinion, but I think that as soon as you start having non-scientific people, if I did a vote on the street today in Montreal and said, how many people think GMOs are bad? Boom, hands go up. How many think they should be outlawed? Boom, gone. And it's done. And I think you should let scientists and regulatory agencies, which we have in Canada, do their job. That's my take on it.
There's a question in the back.
Why do you think the population thinks they're so bad? Why? What is your appreciation or understanding of why so many people have a negative perception of GMOs when we don't really know what we're talking about?
Yeah, my son, we've done a lot of research on this. As near as we can tell, the pivotal moment happened on TV when Roger Beachy was bringing out, back then was a Flavor Saver tomato, and there was a debate on TV, and he was very excited. Scientists were very excited about this new development, and there was and I can't remember her name, there was an environmentalist on there who absolutely questioned the whole thing about, it was like freaky food and how could you be messing with DNA? And you could see in his face just dropped. You could see at that moment that he realized that he hadn't got through. The second reason, and I think that Sara alluded to this, is that the perception of the average person is that GMOs is highly corporatized, and it is. It takes, because of the regulations, because of the amount of safety precautions that have to go into making a GMO product, it takes 13 years and $130 million today. So if you go to Uganda today, the cassava rots in the field with brown streak mosaic. And cassava, a staple crop, the cure for brown streak mosaic is a genetically engineered cassava that will cure that problem. And it's been built by Ugandan and Kenyan scientists, and it sits behind fences. Bacterial wilt and black sigatoga is decimating the banana crops. The cure for it sits behind research walls and is not available to those farmers. Biofortified rice, either iron fortification or zinc fortification, sits behind walls and is not available. I think that people, by and large, have a hate-on for GMOs because they perceive it as being corporatized, but it should be just exactly the opposite. It should be democratized. And CRISPR has the potential, actually, to democratize by significantly dropping the cost of doing work in food and bringing out all sorts of novel traits.
Yeah, I would say it's not just perceived as corporatized, it is corporatized. I mean, the majority of those who are benefiting from it today are the private corporations that are benefiting from it, and it's not every producer in the world. It could, right? It could potentially help many producers. It could help many children who are living with malnutrition, but in practice, it does not always, and that's true. We also know, I mean, I was raised hearing the stories on the news of farmers in India committing suicide around these kinds of crops and having to being caught in the cycle, having to buy more seeds. One of the biggest cases in Canada of a farmer who was taken to court by Monsanto for seeds blowing onto his land and being accused of stealing seeds that he didn't pay for. I mean, those are real reasons why people don't trust GMOs. Now what happens is that the conversation becomes very quickly, you don't understand the science of GMOs, you don't understand the science, you're sowing fear and doubt and you don't understand it. And so if you understood it, you would be fine with this. But people have many legitimate reasons why they object to GMOs for other reasons. And when those just become dismissed because they don't understand the science, any technology can do great things. I mean, everyone's doing research to do all kinds of great things, but if it's used properly is a different question. So I think that's where a lot of the perceptions come from. And labeling, like I said, is maybe not the best way of helping. Labeling in Montreal is not going to help potentially a farmer in India, but that is one of the few ways that individuals feel that they can express their frustration. It may not be the right vehicle for that kind of activism, but it's one that people have identified as being one that's concrete.
Just on the Indian suicide, I got to punch in here because that does not correlate to genetically engineered. In fact, the Indian farmers right now have turned into cotton exporters because of BT cotton. There's no correlation there with suicides and genetic engineering. There could be with debt and the inputs that they have to provide in conventional farming, but it's getting much better. I would say that as an agricultural sector, many of our industry players were heavy-handed. Percy Schmeiser lost the case. But I think that a lot of this came down to heavy-handedness, and it's really easy to paint corporations with a black brush when they come down heavy-handedly. And in many cases, I can't say that they didn't. I can say that farmers who utilize genetic engineering, us in particular, growing canola in Western Canada, we couldn't imagine going back to cultivating and destroying the land with tillage and stuff like that. It just doesn't make sense to us anymore. So yes, corporations do benefit. Yes, they're the main players. Yes, because you all demanded the regulations to be so stringent that it costs $130 million to regulate them. So no, the universities and private researchers can't play. This is the game we painted ourselves into.
Please, over there. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Hi. I am not a scientist, and I'm one of the people who put the hand up for not knowing whether this was good or bad, and I'm here to learn more. I am an educator, and I feel that we missed a tremendous learning opportunity with a series of questions that you presented that were not answered, but would have helped me understand scientifically the principles that lie behind this issue.
Hand me the sweet potato. Oh, okay. All right. Okay, we should go back to just go up. So this sweet potato, I asked the question whether bacteria moving into a species is GMO or not. Agrobacterium was used to bring the gene in that created Roundup Ready crops, created the EPSPS resistance to the shikimate pathway inside of plants so that we can spray Roundup and the plants don't die and the weeds do. That same agrobacterium is inside of sweet potatoes naturally. So Mother Nature GMO'd this sweet potato. It's really weird. When I asked you if a crop could be herbicide tolerant, and you guys said that that was a GMO, but it's not, because Clearfield canola, Clearfield crops were generated through mutagenesis, and you can spray herbicides on those crops, and the weeds die and the crops don't die, and yet they're not genetically engineered. They were engineered through mutagenesis. When I asked you about whether crops could be formulated through dunking in carcinogenic chemicals, you would say that that is GMO'd, but it's not. That's mutagenesis. When you flick 3 genes off inside of an apple to prevent the apple from growing brown, some of you would say that that is or is not, that is genetic engineering. It's called gene silencing to prevent the apples, but no genetic material has been introduced into the apple at all. When you shut down a defective part of the genome in an organism using the latest technology called CRISPR, that is not a GMO in the United States or Canada, but is a GMO in the EU. I love your question. And I think that we have failed in our educational system to teach students about agriculture because it's complicated. There's 3 or 4 or 5 computer monitors in a combine today. These things are multi-million-dollar machines. And agriculture is not bibs and overalls and round pickup trucks and, little red barns. It's not. It's not. And many people are so divorced from it. So, sorry.
You answered her question.
I'll take that back.
Okay.
Couple questions. The first one being, it's the scientific community, because I would like to tap into that and figure they've done the most extensive research. Is the scientific community unanimous on that GMOs is a good thing? Or are there some out there saying, whoa, stay away from that, my research says something different? And secondly, my second question, if I could, is it mandatory for all food in Canada to be labeled where they're coming from, the country of origin? Like I've looked at stuff from Walmart. Seems that's an awful good price, but I want to be sure it's coming from Canada. And it says it's packaged in, or they have different other things, but I don't see made in Canada or grown in Canada or produced in Canada. Is that mandatory?
So country of origin labeling is very complicated and very contentious, and it's constantly a source of international trade disputes. And in some cases we have it, in some cases we don't. In some cases it's considered a value-added claim. In some cases it's not. So we have different kinds of labels even in Quebec. I mean, we have Aliments du Québec, Produits du Québec, and there's also different rules about whether it was produced in Quebec or comes from ingredients from other places and came to Quebec, but then those ingredients were then produced in Quebec. So there's all kinds of different rules around that. Ontario has its own. So it's quite complicated, especially when it comes to things like meat. So that's where you see constant trade wars between the US and Canada and other countries. That's just the short answer. It's not entirely clear when and how country of origin should be on the label.
Sounds like no. They don't have to put down that they come from Canada or come from US or China.
No, but also that in some cases putting it on could potentially be a problem. It's not only that they're not mandatory, they could be prohibited under certain circumstances because they'd be seen as a barrier to trade.
Okay.
So I'll take your first question. This is my yeah but sheet. There's GMO in the middle and all the extensions are the yeah buts. So, yeah, GMO, but one of the latest stats I had, because I knew this question was going to come up, one of the latest stats that I have is like 57% of Americans are unsure or don't agree with GMOs, and 88% of U.S. scientists do. One of the most detailed study was released in 2016 with the National Academy of Science and Engineering. They looked at 900 studies. 20 scientists spent over 2 years looking at 20 years of data. And whether it's the French Academy of Science, the African Academy of Science, European Commission, the British Royal Society, the American Medical Association, Canadian Regulatory Association, all of them have said, and quote unquote, that genetic engineered food doesn't present any more risk per se than any conventional bred food. So that's the answer to that question that I have. No, it's not unanimous. I don't think in science you ever get unanimous. So it's the closest I got was 88%. Okay. And some say higher, some say lower, but 88% was a pretty consistent one that I picked up.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I guess that my concern is not so much what's in the genetically modified food that I eat. I don't care really what I put in my mouth. My concern is, why was it modified, to what end? Now, I'm reading a lot recently about a serious reduction in the population of flying insects. And someone actually pointed out the other day that if you take a drive in your car in the country, we used to have to stop and clean the windshield every 5 minutes. I'm not getting windshield splatter anymore. So is that an issue? Well, it may be an issue if these insects pollinate. So then the question is, well, why is there a reduction? There are many answers, though I don't think the science is secure on this. But one answer is possibly overuse of pesticides, herbicides, and so on. So then I hear that some genetically modified crops are designed to resist Roundup-ready herbicide. And then I ask the question, well, would that encourage an overuse of this herbicide to weeds, which I guess at some point will develop a resistance, because that's what happens. So when I kind of put those things together, I start to be a little bit concerned about some genetically modified organisms, not because of what they are per se, but what the long-term consequences are of their production and why they were produced that way.
Okay. Lots of points there, and try to address them as I can. First of all, we bred Roundup-ready crops to use Roundup instead of a whole bunch of other herbicides, so Roundup would have zero effect on your insect question. It's a herbicide. You're referring to insecticides, which I'll get to. A Roundup, people are freaked out over Roundup, but they never ask the question, what did Roundup replace? And what would farmers use if they didn't have access to Roundup? Well, they'd go back to atrazine and metachlora and those types of products that had higher impacts on the environment. Roundup-ready resistant weeds, yes. It's easy. You plant the seed, spray Roundup, and if you do that over and over again, you can get some resistance to weeds. However, ALS, which is another group of herbicides, way more resistance to ALS herbicides and the IMI herbicides than there is to Roundup. I bring to point UK. In the UK, there isn't any Roundup resistant crops to be grown, and blackgrass is prolific there, such a problem, so it's a resistant weed. So resistance can happen in any herbicide regime, and a lot of farmers, it was pretty easy. Some guys got lazy, too much Roundup in the rotation. Yes, we have some resistance. The last point on the bugs. So one of the most successful genetically engineered crops, genetically engineered advances, is actually the integration of Bacillus thuringiensis into crops. Bacillus thuringiensis is an organic bacteria. Yes, I said that. It's an organic pesticide. So organic users can use Bacillus thuringiensis to spray on the crop of their organic crop to control the Lepidoptera, can control caterpillars, and so on and so forth. We took a couple of events or a couple of genes from BT and put them into cotton, corn, and soybeans, and brinjal and squash, eggplant. And the reduction in insecticides, which is where I'm going with this, is amazing. This is something that's never reported, and you folks don't know much about it. But between 1996 and 2006. BT genetically engineered crops, that's crops that are resistant to the bugs, have resulted in the decrease of 136.6 million kilograms of insecticide sprayed on the crop. So, contrary to your initial theory, where GM crops resulted in fewer insects, they actually resulted in a great big decrease in insecticide being sprayed. There's one more comment, and that revolves around this whole issue of seed treatment and neonicotinoids, which, again, none of the questions you raised are GMO per se, but we knew they were going to come up. Seed treatments are very important, and there's a movement right now to outlaw seed treatments for farmers, neonicotinoids. Well, if you outlaw seed treatments and we don't have something to fight flea beetles, wireworm, and cutworm, guess what we're going to spray on? Insecticides, because we have to protect the crop. Now, the observation of bugs worse or better, I can't comment. It's anecdotal at best, and I don't have the pop stats in my head. I've answered the question as good as I can.
Thank you very much for the questions. I think I'm going to take 3 more, and then we'll try to wrap up. Yes, please.
So I'm just wondering if there's been any reflection from Health Canada or the government on food labels serving more marketing purpose than actual helpful information. And so I'm a professor at this faculty of nutrition, and I have spent some time learning about health claims and nutrient claims. I know those are very tightly regulated, and I consider those very useful labels. Like learning that there's a product that's fortified with plant sterols, can reduce LDL cholesterol, contribute to heart disease prevention, that's really useful. But when I hear about organic labels, non-GMO, I try to think of what's the utility, what's the gain in information, and I think of it more as a marketing strategy. And so I know you mentioned these are voluntary labels, but does the government recognize that, you know, it's a little bit of a toss-up between what's actually useful information for consumers and what's more just marketing of a product?
Definitely. So that's where you get to the different, I mean, you mentioned voluntary versus mandatory. There's certainly marketing that goes into this, and so there are certain rules. So both Health Canada, with the Food and Drugs Act, and then in Quebec, the Food Product Act, both have prohibitions against misleading or false advertising and labeling. So anything that would be considered to be fraudulent or misleading, you know, there could be litigation around that, or there could be fines around that. So that doesn't really get to the marketing, but I guess it does get to people, you know, profiting off of certain labels. But the reason that those labels are there, some people will choose organic because they think it's offering health benefits that they wouldn't be getting from non-organic foods. But kind of one of the things that I was trying to get to in my presentation is that we make choices around food that are not only about nutrients. You know, so if we choose a certain kind of cheese, it's not only, or often maybe it's in spite of knowing kind of what its nutrient properties are, but because it has other kinds of meanings to us. And so we eat certain foods on holidays that we know aren't good for us. We eat certain foods because they remind us of home. We eat certain foods because we want to encourage a certain kind of production. And that's what those labelings can do. Those labels are also marketing tools. And so especially, again, when it comes to animal welfare, you know, those are certainly marketing tools that can be actually very misleading. So anything that, you know, humane and animal welfare approved and all those things, they're very much marketing tools, but they're also responding to a very genuine concern among consumers who are interested in, you know, not only is this going to kill me when I eat it, not only is it going to make me strong if I eat it, but is it consistent with my values? So it's very complex and it's very hard to regulate, and maybe, you know, it's not always Health Canada's job to be regulating in that way because they're not always health claims. So it's a bit messy, but that's kind of where labeling, I mean, in terms of food law is really where a lot of the private litigation exists because it's so complex and there's so many different opinions about it.
I read some stuff around CFIA, and it says there that food manufacturers will not have misleading labels on their food, and yet non-GMO avocado oil, non-GMO Himalayan rock salt. It's salt coming out of the Himalayan mountains, you know, to go with your non-GMO paving stones, I suppose. Non-GMO water, non-GMO lettuce, non-GMO spinach, non-GMO carrots, all of these things, and they're non-GMO tomatoes, and on and on and on. And every time you see the butterfly, I pick another brand, non-GMO Catelli pasta. It's durum wheat, for God's sakes. And there is no genetically engineered wheat. So I think that CFIA has some work to do. I think they need to pick up their bootstraps and come down hard on some of these misleading. If there is a label for example, a corn product, and there is genetic engineering in it, and the product says non-genetic engineered corn product, I buy it because there could be a choice. But the rest of it, I think, is just marketing.
All right, we have one more question here, and then the last one over here. So,
this is a question that is sort of on the periphery of GMOs, but pertains to the health aspect of foods that are purchased in Canada. In Southeast Asia, massive amounts of fish are grown in fish farms, where directly over the above the water are chicken pens who walk on screens, and the total nutrition that the fish get are what the chickens defecate. Now, apparently, when you get these fish products sold here, you can't tell. You see fish, and they've been passed and everything. Now, I don't even know if it is bad. I assume it doesn't sound very healthy to me if that is their sole bit of nutrition. But can you comment on it? Is it potentially bad for us, and is it slipping through the cracks? And how does that compare to GMO?
I'm going to let Sarah take this one.
So I personally can't speak to the safety of the fish. Health Canada works with Canada Border Services Agency, CBSA, to make sure that food that makes its way into the country meets their safety standards. But what you're raising, so potentially this is safe, and so I'm not sure. We are a bit squeamish about, if you say defecation, but also, we also know that we could be using a fertilizer that comes from human waste and is used in certain places and is completely safe. So in the same way that we could roll our eyes about some people's concerns about GMOs, someone else could be rolling their eyes about concern over this kind of fish. There's all kinds of different perspectives about what we're comfortable with. But you are touching on, the regulatory agency's role, first of all, to set certain standards and to make sure that that's what's coming in, but also just the complexity of food standards in a global food market where food fraud is really the big problem. So, 30 years ago, we were all discovering new kinds of scientific techniques to test the safety of food, to see what kind of had pathogens in it, and we were testing. But now we're kind of actually in many ways regressing. We're going back to the problems we faced 100, 150 years ago, which is just about fraud. In this global food system, there's a lot of money to be made off fraudulent products. And so this is not the fish that you're talking about, but just the way in which Health Canada or every country is expected now to make sure and assess the quality and safety of food. In some cases, it may be safe, but it's just not what you think it is. In some cases, it's unsafe. So it's actually a very complex area of regulatory oversight right now, and it's gaining, the government is aware that there's a problem, although this particular example might not be the biggest of its concerns.
thank you. And one last question.
I totally agree with you, Sarah, that there's so many areas involved with labeling and genetically modified foods. It's economic, it's cultural. I'm just going to speak to my concerns as an individual who's not a scientist, just a person who grew up in the 60s as a child, where everything then probably was organic. People were healthier. Children were still living, getting a little bit taller than their parents, living a little bit longer than their parents. This generation of young children probably will be the first that won't live as long as their parents. Part of the reason is food. I have learned to mistrust the scientists and the big corporations. We were told in the 70s that margarine is better for us than butter, so we switched to margarine for a decade or so until they told us it was really terrible for you. Then we all switched to canola oil as opposed to olive and avocado, which are the more natural, wholesome foods. So in my case, I am at an age now where I want to have a good quality of life in my old age. I don't want to have to be dependent on people to look after me. So I try to eat well. I cook my own food from real things. But are these things that look real, are they really healthy? I don't really have an answer to this question after tonight's session. Are they healthy? Because sometimes it takes decades, sometimes longer, to see the health effects.
I'll just start off with, I think with science, as you bring up the margarine butter thing, absolutely great example. Like, which way should we go? Trans fats, bad or good? Canola oil has a tremendously healthy profile. Coconut oil is exactly the opposite. Which way should we go? I can't answer that question. And science keeps bringing out new information as we move along. We are living longer. Many of you in this room will see 100, believe it or not. So we will live longer. I think that the quality of life is one that you bring up, and it's on everybody's mind. I think that as farmers growing food, this is one of the things that goes to the heart of a farmer. They're harvesting right now, or not, depending if they're going to get rain or snow right now. And it's not funny, because they've got hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars out in the field right now, and they can't get to it. And when the rhetoric goes on the way it does, that farmers somehow are producing unhealthy food, it goes to the heart. We don't wake up in the morning as farmers thinking we're going to grow food in some manner that's going to poison our very customers. That doesn't wash. That's not the way a farmer thinks. And I can speak to you for sure about this. We just released a paper. In fact, it'll be available after. Chris Dufault's here in the room. Chris and I just summarized 30 years of corn and soybean production in Ontario with Ontario government data on herbicide use. You need to read that. It's a great news story. I think that you're sharing exactly what so many people are sharing, and that's this unease about food, because this marketing's going on, and there's science, and you're so far disconnected from agriculture. It's fair. I can tell you that I work in I don't sell fertilizer, chemical, or seed. I work with farmers directly on an advisory role. I never have worked for a glyphosate company, but I can tell you that I want to produce food the way we are today, as opposed to the way we were in the 60s and 70s. I'll take this over that any day. And I'm hoping that through technology and progression, we can do it even in a better manner going forward to even increase human life. So that's my wrap up on that comment.
Great. Thank you very much. So in order to wrap this up, I wanted to give each of you one more minute to maybe say something that hasn't come up yet, or go back to something that you heard and you maybe learned tonight. So Sara, please start.
Okay, so I think that my takeaway from our conversation this evening is that I haven't left feeling any more convinced of one side or the other. I'm still as ambivalent as before. That also comes with my discipline. That's how we're trained to think about both sides of the coin, and I'm not really sure which. I don't think there's a clear winner, because I think that everything is contextual, and so there's the science, there's the way in which it's applied, there's the way that consumers make decisions, there's the way that producers choose to produce. There are many, many different factors that shape how we use GE foods, why we use them, whether they're safe, if they're safe. So there's a lot of contextual things. But I do think that what's important, and what kind of came out for me this evening, and which is the reason why I'm also happy to be here, is that we need more opportunities to have these conversations in a way that is not as confrontational or as dismissive in which they have been taking place. And I say this coming from the perspective of a lawyer, where we are often know-it-alls, but also from the scientists, right? So, I mean, food law is a really, in many ways, it's an unfortunate area of regulation, because you have two disciplines that are both very, very sure of themselves, but very dismissive of many of the concerns, the legitimate concerns of people, and are not really willing to have a conversation. So listening to each other, I mean, It sounds trite, but it's really important for us to have these conversations where it's not quickly shutting down people on either side and kind of listening, because we don't have a clear answer. And I don't think, I mean, we both agree that there's not going to be a silver bullet to feeding the population. There's not a silver bullet to addressing climate change. There's not a silver bullet in any of this. We have lots of technology. The question is how we use it, and we have to be having those conversations openly and democratically in order to move forward.
Thank you for that wrap up.
A story of two crops. Tomatoes. One of the diseases that attacks tomatoes is blight. They can spray tomatoes up to 40 times with fungicides to get the tomatoes nice to your table. There's one gene from sweet pepper. They can put it inside the tomato, never have to use a fungicide again because it cures the late blight. We can't use that tomato because the public is scared of genetic engineering. That's a sad thing. Potatoes. Potatoes are sprayed between 15 and 17 times for late blight. In Ireland, the home of the Irish potato famine, they have discovered that grabbing one gene out of a Peruvian potato and putting this, a wild potato that's resistant to blight, putting that inside of commercial potatoes, they could dramatically reduce their fungicide sprays, and yet we can't do it because the public is scared of genetic engineering. This is a sad state of affairs. Sara said there isn't one size fits all. Farmers in Uganda and Kenya are different than farmers in India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Australia, and certainly in North America. But my call to action is if people simply stand up and say, no GMO, no GMO, get rid of it, then you're taking out one of the most valuable tools in a farmer's toolbox to ensure global food security.
So I think we had a very interesting discussion tonight. And first of all, I would like to thank you for being here. I thought the questions were hyper interesting. They showed us that there were so many different angles, even more than the two angles that we had here, but so many different angles to this. And of course, we were not here to solve this question or to find that silver bullet. We were here to have this intelligent discourse on the topic and hopefully have widened our horizon in terms of understanding what the issues actually are so that we can speak to them. Before we leave, I would like to thank you, both of you, for making yourselves available. And we have a small token presents for both of you from the faculty. Thank you very much. And before we finish, we would like to give Jean de Grandpré his birthday present, because I believe he will not quite be 100 yet, but very soon, very close.
Thank you.
And with that, we end our session. I invite all of you to a small reception that we have over at the faculty lounge, which is about 50 meters from here to your right when you exit the room. And I invite you to join me in one last time for a big round of applause for our panelists.